Right and Wrong. Written by J.M. Kuczynski. Narrated by Mitchell Johnson. Introduction 1.0. Cowardice and laziness, the basis for much spurious moralizing. Deep down, we know what's right and we know what's wrong, but because our instinctual knowledge of morality is often antithetical to the morality with which we're indoctrinated, and because official morality speaks clearly and unambiguously, whereas our private moral intuitions speak subtly and equivocally, fear of isolation and of outright hostility at the hands of others drive us to accept moral views with which we are not, in our heart of hearts, entirely at ease. Inevitably, we rationalize these fear-driven, disingenuous moral viewpoints, and although we're seldom fully convinced by our own rationalizations, the effect, ironically, is that we become even more shrill and dogmatic in our acceptance of those very viewpoints that were imposed on us from without, and in whose authenticity we never fully believed. In this section, we'll find that by taking a moment to articulate our ethical viewpoints, I mean the viewpoints that we actually have as opposed to the ones that society claims to be right, we'll find that they are less antisocial, more reasonable, and more conducive to feasible interpersonal and intrapersonal relations than some of their popularly sanctioned rivals. We'll thus explore the complex ethical issues concerning the extent to which concern for others ought to be confluent with one's concern for oneself, and the extent to which the one ought to be subordinated to the other. We'll also discuss delicate issues relating to the rightful role of government, the degree of overlap between morality and legality, the religious basis of ethical thought, the ethical basis of religious thought, the inherently ambiguous nature of ethical obligation, and finally, the various legitimate and illegitimate ways that ethicists and laymen have sought to eliminate these ambiguities, along with the theoretical obscurities in which they are embedded. We'll find that, contrary to what is commonly held, there's nothing subjective about ethical judgments. But because ethical conflict always involves a multiplicity of parties, no two of whose interests coincide, and each of whose interests has at least some legitimacy, the overall structure of the situation is so intricate and thus so incapable of being recognized by our fast and ready fear and hate-driven moral categories that what is in fact a delicate crystalline situation, to whose exquisite anatomy only the philosophical equivalent of a neurosurgeon could do justice, is seen as an amorphous Rorschach test, concerning which any emotional effusion is as valid as the next. Afraid that the complex and troubling moral realities before them are too much for their compromised critical faculties to handle, and also afraid that they couldn't properly adjudicate the moral disputes arising out of those realities without unsettling long-standing sources of solace and emotional equilibrium, people often fearfully regress to a position of moral nihilism. That is, they come to espouse the increasingly popular, especially over the last 30 years, view there is no right and there is no wrong. Its proponents pass the sentiment off as liberal tolerance for one's fellows, even though nothing could be more opposed to genuine liberalism than nihilism. This ethical open-mindedness is in fact merely an excuse to sidestep the difficulties involved in training one's mind to be capable of thinking rigorously. The existence of ethical truth having been denied, real merit is lampooned as corporate conformism, whose epistemological underpinnings are a slavish devotion to black and white modes of thought constitutive of post-medieval rationalism. As a result, what is represented as moral openness is more likely than not the closed-minded winery of the record store clerk, who, being too lazy to make something of himself, chose to blame the system, and who, through his indolence, actually consolidated the system. Such nihilism is also an assault on the very legitimate standards in terms of which success and failure are judged. Being cloaked as universal tolerance, this decorticated faux openness, which silences all opposition to itself by declaring reason and argumentation to be the instruments of false consciousness or some such, is allowed to spread like a cancer, eroding the intellectual, personal, ethical, and institutional verities that give life much of its richness. By looking at numerous concrete examples of ethical conflict, we'll find that where many ethical dilemmas are concerned, there is often no one right or wrong way of resolving ethical disputes. There are various competing interests, each legitimate. This doesn't mean that there is no ethical truth. On the contrary, it means that there are too many ethical truths. Thus, resolving the situation consists in striking an optimal balance. But somebody must draw the short straw. A certain amount of immorality and injustice are inherent in situations involving more than a very small number of people. Morality is injustice. Justice is morality divided by the limitations on resources with which the real world forces us to deal. Throughout the class, we'll pay special attention to the various logical sophists
Sample complete. Ready to continue?